Whatever names you have for Vince McMahon in this present day, you can't deny he's an opportunist. When you look at the countless stars he's created in the WWE over the last 3 decades, the likes of Hulk Hogan, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels and John Cena just to name a few, you'd think he has one of the best insights of taking a wrestler and making a star out of them regardless of their wrestling ability. Well, that hasn't always been the case, as these wrestlers Vince handpicked to push to the moon never even lifted off the ground. Join us now as Wrestlelamia looks at 9 terrible wrestlers Vince McMahon tried to push to be a megastar, but failed miserably. Keep in mind though, even though fans hate wrestlers like Baron Corbin and Roman Reigns, some of Vince's most beloved of the current era, they are not terrible wrestlers, and possess some skill, unlike these wrestlers. Number 1. King Mabel. 500+ pound wrestler Nelson Frazier, aka Mabel, was in the right place at the right time when Vince McMahon saw the big man as his next big monster heel. Now, 1995 was a rough year for the WWF, both in terms of business and creativity, but despite McMahon's sense that Mabel couldn't turn things around, he couldn't have been more wrong. Mabel couldn't wrestle, and his habit of accidentally injuring opponents made him a liability. The fans didn't buy him as a heel either and hated him in the worst way, despising his presence so much they just wanted him to go away. With top stars including The Undertaker complaining about Mabel's habit for hurting opponents, and the fans indifferent to Mabel, Vince McMahon was forced to release him before he injured another top WWE superstar. Number 2. Tom McGee. It's early on in this list and we'll skip any jokes of Vince McMahon loving big sweaty muscle men. However, it's pretty hard to keep those at bay when you look at Tom McGee, who definitely had the physique and look to turn Vince McMahon's head and shout out, "Oh my goodness!" To be fair to Vince, McGee looked like a superstar. He was 6'5", 275 pounds with a chiseled body and long blonde hair. Remind you of someone at the time? Yep, Vince had hopes of McGee becoming the next Hulk Hogan. In fact, when the infamous, deemed to be lost forever but found now, tryout match with Bret Hart happened in 1986, Vince was thoroughly impressed, and within earshot backstage, Bret Hart heard, "He's the successor to Hulk Hogan." However, his well-performed match with Hart was just an illusion, as despite being trained by the legendary Stu Hart, McGee was greener than Tajiri's mist, and it was in fact Bret who 100% carried him throughout the match, making him look like a star. Bret cleverly asked for McGee's 3 best moves and worked around it. Bret noted, "As good as he looked, he was horrible, pathetically phony. He couldn't walk across the ring without tripping. I struggled to maneuver him into place without the fans realizing his shortcomings." This was evident when McGee faced other talent where he didn't have the guidance of Bret to carry him. So even though Vince initially had visions of grandeur for McGee in 1986, he quickly gave up on him after seeing him wrestle. Number 3. Nathan Jones. The ex-convict and weightlifter Nathan Jones was hyped tremendously during the start of the Ruthless Aggression era. With WWE's well-produced vignettes, they hyped his debut by incorporating his criminal past, waiting 10 years for this opportunity but still portraying a man that has not learnt from his incarceration. Vince believed he had all the makings of a main eventer, and his real-life infamy in Australia helped. However, things didn't start off well, as Jones was unable to make his original debut due to his criminal record, thus his visa for entry to the US was rejected, and WWE subsequently had to go back to the drawing board. The character was unfortunately scrapped, and instead, Jones was billed as The Undertaker's protege. Granted, this was an easy way to gain some credibility, as Jones's wrestling skills were awful. WWE believed he was so bad they removed him from the tag match at WrestleMania 19, as they believed he could have inadvertently brought down the Dead Man. After a substantial absence, Jones returned as a villain and nicknamed the Colossus of Boggo Road. Needless to say, it didn't catch on, and Jones left the company after 2 years. Number 4. Zeus. In 1989, Hulkamania was still running wild in the WWF, and both Hogan and Vince wanted to try and squeeze every penny's worth out of it by Hogan starring in his own film, No Holds Barred. He wouldn't be known as Hulk Hogan though, he was Rip Thomas, a wrestler who was modelled after Hogan, that being a champion and a role model for children. The antagonist was Zeus, played by Tiny Lister, who was a human wrecking machine and threatened to end the champion for good. Spoiler alert, similar to Hogan in the WWF, Rip prevailed, destroying Zeus. However, after the movie bombed at the box office, Vince tried a last-ditch attempt to bring Zeus into the WWF, claiming he wasn't finished with him and this was no movie. This would have been good if Zeus was a trained wrestler, but in fact, Zeus looked like he had as much wrestling training than he did in the film, which was virtually none. His shortcomings were well hidden though, as he was paired up with the Macho King, and the biggest move he performed was a scoop slam. For whatever reason, Vince still thought there was money to be made and wanted a Hogan vs Zeus program to main event WrestleMania 6. Thankfully, he came to his senses and scrapped the idea. Number 5. Mordecai. There's always been a good versus evil dynamic in the WWE, but Vince took things to a new level when he introduced one of his own creations, Mordecai, a religious zealot, who promised to banish the WWE of all their sins. He dressed in white and even had his hair and eyebrows bleached to signify his purity, even though he was a heel. The man who played Mordecai, Kevin Fertig, spoke on Vince being thoroughly impressed with the character after Fertig pitched it to him, saying, "I laid out my idea, long coats and a cross, almost popish, and even vignettes with a confessional where I punch through the confessional booth and choke out the sinner." Vince's eyes blew up and he looked at me and said, "Holy shit." After the meeting, Fertig was flagged down by John Laurinaitis and said, Laurinaitis grabbed me when I walked out and said, "Son, you're about to make $1 million. Vince even wanted Mordecai to face The Undertaker at WrestleMania 21. He told, "It was supposed to be me and Taker at WrestleMania 21. This was going to be even more unique because the cowboy dressed all in black was the good guy and the guy in white was evil. We would have built that up throughout the whole year, which we would have also allowed Taker some time for a smoke and mirrors angle so he could rest the wear and tear on his body." Now, Mordecai's wrestling skills were so-so, but that didn't turn off Vince. What did was Fertig being involved in a bar fight, which led to a lawsuit and Vince dropping him immediately. Fertig would return, but under a new gimmick as a short-lived vampire on ECW. Number 6. Mason Ryan. Mason Ryan joined CM Punk's new Nexus, providing some serious muscle for the group. Mason had the body type Vince McMahon still looks for in future superstars, so it's no surprise he landed a spot in the WWE. However, even Mason's muscles couldn't hide a lack of wrestling ability and inability to connect with the WWE audience, and even though they gave him a good enough push to the main roster, Vince halted any push after knowing that he was greener than grass. Number 7. The Great Khali. One of wrestling's tallest competitors, Vince McMahon likely saw a lot in the Punjabi Nightmare, as how else to explain the monster push Khali received. Vince obviously loved Khali's size and was infatuated by the Punjabi playboy, personally asking him to sign with the WWE. In an interview with the Daily Pioneer, Khali mentioned, "I signed the contract in 2005. McMahon sent a limousine to get me from the premiere of The Longest Yard in New York, and he wanted to see me in person. Normally he doesn't do that, but in my case he made an exception. He asked if I wanted to work with WWE, and I gladly said yes." But as imposing as he was, his lack of moves and wrestling talent led to fans longing for the days of King Mabel. Despite this and his lack of English, as Khali would have Ranjan Singh by his side as an interpreter, Vince pushed him to the moon, where he would most notably feud with The Undertaker and John Cena and ultimately win one of the most illustrious belts in wrestling history, the World Heavyweight Championship. Vince was definitely high on him, but the fans, not so much. Number 8. Giant Gonzales. It's 1993 and wrestling is currently in the midst of a slump. What could save it in Vince's mind? Well, possibly a legitimate giant, as Vince McMahon envisioned what he believed would be a massive main event for SummerSlam, as he wanted to pit the legit 7'6" Giant Gonzales against Hulk Hogan. There was just one problem. It was painfully obvious that the Giant had zero wrestling skills, as he debuted in a feud against The Undertaker, and their meet at WrestleMania 9 has been long considered one of the worst WrestleMania matches in history. Thus, Vince's idea of putting Gonzales in the main event quickly deteriorated. And number 9. Luther Reigns. Matthew Wise trained at the WCW Power Plant before appearing in WCW briefly as Horseshoe, a powerfully built wrestler with a nickname derived from his horseshoe-like haircut. Wise worked in Ultimate Pro Wrestling, then the AWA Superstars Wrestling, but struck gold when he was brought to the WWE in 2003 with the plans of being pushed to near main event level. However, even the late great Eddie Guerrero, who Bob Holly noted in his book, couldn't even get him over. Holly wrote, "Luther Reigns was another big, impressive looking guy who just didn't get it. He didn't understand the concept of storytelling or wrestling psychology. He didn't understand why you should or should not do a headlock or arm drag in a certain spot." He went on to say, Eddie apparently went way above and beyond to try and help him, even as his body was failing him and he was in constant pain. Unfortunately, no matter how much Eddie tried, he could never even get him to wrestle an acceptable quality match, let alone a good one. Reigns would only last year after experiencing creative differences with Paul Heyman and agreed to his release in 2005, never becoming the star that Vince envisioned. But there you have it, guys. 9 terrible wrestlers Vince McMahon tried to push to be a megastar, but failed miserably. Are there any that are missing from the list? Let us know in the comments down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.